There are three sounds a 14-year-old never forgets. The hollow thud of a casket being lowered into the ground, the click of a deadbolt locking you out of the only home you've ever known, and the silence that follows when you realize no one is coming to save you. Jeffrey heard all three in the span of 21 days. Now he stood on a darkening porch with nothing but a backpack, his dead father's leather jacket, and a dog who refused to leave his side, staring at a choice that shouldn't exist. Stay and beg the woman who'd just thrown him out like trash, or walk in a woods so deep that people who went in didn't always come back out. The thing about survival is that it makes you do things you never thought you'd do. Go places you never thought you'd go. Trust people you never thought you'd trust. Jeffrey chose the woods. What he found 3 miles and would save his life. Or destroy it. He doesn't know which yet. The porch light behind him flickered once. Then died Francis's final message that he no longer existed to her. Jeffrey's fingers trembled as he zipped his father's jacket higher against the cold, breathing in the fading scent of Old Spice and cigarette smoke, the only thing left of the man who'd promised to always protect him. That promise was ash now, scattered in a cemetery Jeffrey would probably never visit again. Ranger pressed against his leg, a solid wall of muscle and loyalty, amber eyes reflecting the dying light. The German Shepherd mix had been Jeffrey's shadow since he was 9, pulled from a ditch behind a grocery store and bonded by the kind of love that doesn't need words. If Jeffrey's father had taught him anything, it was this: dogs don't lie. Dogs don't pretend. Dogs don't throw you away when you become inconvenient. People do. His belongings lay scattered across the steps like evidence at a crime scene. Jeans with holes in the knees, hoodies that still smelled like the basement where he'd hidden during Francis's rages, his father's watch with the cracked face that had stopped the exact moment his heart gave out. Everything Jeffrey owned in the world, treated like garbage because to Francis, that's exactly what he was. A burden, a mistake, a problem she could finally erase now that his father wasn't alive to see it. The neighborhood watched without watching. Mrs. Chin's curtains twitched across the street. The Hendersons' porch light clicked on 2 houses down, close enough to see everything, far enough to pretend they didn't. That's how it works in nice suburban neighborhoods, where people pride themselves on minding their own business. A 14-year-old kid standing homeless on a porch in November? Not their problem. Not their kid. Not their responsibility to ask questions that might require uncomfortable answers. Jeffrey gathered what he could carry, his hands shaking from cold or shock or both. The photo album included the first pictures of his father before the sickness, before Francis, before everything fell apart. Then the jacket, the watch, a change of clothes. He left the rest, because what did any of it matter when you had nowhere to go? "We can't stay here, boy," he whispered to Ranger, his voice steady despite everything crumbling inside him. His father had taught him that too. Never let them see you break. Save the breaking for when you're alone, when the performance is over, when there's no one left to prove your strength to. They walked. Past the mailbox with his father's name still on it. Past the oak tree where Jeffrey had built a treehouse in 4th grade, back when he believed building something meant it would last. Past every memory that lived in this place that had stopped being home the moment his father's heart stopped beating. Each step felt like drowning in slow motion, but Jeffrey kept moving because the alternative was standing still, and standing still meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant shattering into pieces too small to ever put back together. The woods waited at the edge of town like an open mouth. Dark, hungry, promising nothing except the cold mercy of being somewhere Francis couldn't find him. Jeffrey walked toward that darkness with his dog and his dead father's jacket and a question that burned in his chest like a living thing. How much are you willing to sacrifice to survive? And when you find out, will you still recognize yourself? The forest swallowed them whole. And somewhere deep in those trees, in a cabin that shouldn't exist, with people who seemed too good to be true, Jeffrey was about to learn that the most dangerous traps are the ones that feel like rescue. The ones that promise you everything you've ever wanted. The ones that ask for only one small thing in return: your soul. The funeral had been 3 weeks ago, but Francis waited exactly 21 days before she made her move. Jeffrey learned later that's how long it took for the life insurance claim to be denied. His father's policy had lapsed 6 months before the heart attack. One more bill that slipped through the cracks when the pharmacy job cut his hours. Without that money, Frances saw no reason to pretend anymore. She'd been cold at the service, standing apart from Jeffrey while he stared at the closed casket and tried to understand that his father was actually inside it. She wore black, but checked her phone throughout the eulogy. When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to share memories, Frances stayed silent while Jeffrey's voice cracked talking about the camping trips they used to take back when his dad still had energy for things like that. Back when there was still hope that Frances might learn to love the son that came with the man she married. That hope died the same day his father did. The days after blurred together casseroles from neighbors Frances threw away. Phone calls with lawyers Jeffrey wasn't allowed to hear, papers signed in the dining room, while Jeffrey sat upstairs listening to the house decide his future without him. Frances grew colder each day, her resentment no longer hidden behind thin smiles. She stopped cooking for him, stopped asking about school, stopped pretending he existed except as an obstacle between her and whatever life she'd planned before his father complicated it. Then tonight, as dusk settled and the temperature dropped, she simply opened the front door and pointed. "Get out." Jeffrey stood in the hallway, confused. "What? You heard me. I want you gone. Now." She wasn't yelling. That somehow made it worse. Her voice was flat, businesslike, like she was firing an employee who'd failed to meet expectations. "Your father left me with $30,000 in debt and a mortgage I can't afford. I'm not feeding you too. But where am I supposed to? Not my problem." She started grabbing his clothes from the hallway closet, throwing them toward the door. "Your mother didn't want you. Your father's dead. I'm done playing pretend family." Jeffrey's legs felt weak. This couldn't be real. People didn't just throw kids out. There were laws, services, someone who was supposed to stop this. But Frances had already thought that she'd called the school that morning, telling them Jeffrey was moving to live with relatives out of state. She'd covered her tracks, made herself look responsible while erasing him from her life. He gathered what he could: the leather jacket, a framed photo of his father, Ranger's leash from the hook by the door. His hands moved automatically while his brain struggled to catch up. Frances watched without expression as he stuffed clothes into his backpack, as he stood on the porch looking back one last time at the house where he'd lived since he was 6. The deadbolt clicked. Ranger pressed against his leg, warm and solid and real when everything else felt like a nightmare. Jeffrey's chest ached with a grief too big for his body, but his eyes stayed dry. He was past crying. He was just gone. The pavement ended half a mile past the last streetlight, giving way to packed dirt that turned to mud under Jeffrey's feet. Ranger led the way into the tree line, his shepherd instincts navigating the darkness better than Jeffrey's shock-dulled senses ever could. The forest swallowed them whole. One moment they were on the edge of civilization. The next they were deep in woods so thick the moonlight barely penetrated. Jeffrey's legs burned. His backpack straps dug into his shoulders. The leather jacket that had felt comforting an hour ago now weighed him down, but he couldn't take it off. It was all he had left of his father, and letting go of it felt like losing him twice. The temperature kept dropping. Jeffrey could see his breath now, small clouds of vapor that disappeared into the black air. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since the stale granola bar at lunch. Frances had stopped buying groceries 3 days ago, preparing for this moment even if Jeffrey hadn't seen it coming. His water bottle was empty. His phone was at 30% battery. Not that there was signal out here anyway. What am I doing? The thought crashed through his careful numbness. Where am I even going? He had no plan, no destination. He'd just walked because staying meant watching Frances lock him out, and his body had chosen movement over that humiliation. But now, deep in woods he didn't know, Jeffrey felt the full weight of his situation settle onto his 14-year-old shoulders like a physical thing trying to crush him into the ground. He was alone, truly, completely alone in a way he'd never been before. Even when his mother left, he'd had his father. Even during the worst nights of his dad's illness, there had been someone. Now there was just Ranger in the darkness and the terrible question of how a kid survived when the entire world had decided he didn't matter. Jeffrey stopped walking, his breath coming hard and fast. Panic clawed at his chest. Where would he sleep? What would he eat tomorrow? What happened when his phone died and he couldn't even call for help? Not that he knew who to call. Child services? Would they believe him? Would they just send him back to Francis, who'd lie and smile and make him look like a troubled teen running away from discipline? Always do right, even when it costs you. His father's voice echoed in his memory, words spoken 1,000 times during 1,000 small moments. When Jeffrey wanted to cheat on a math test, when he found $20 on the sidewalk and wanted to keep it, when doing the right thing meant losing something he desperately wanted. But what was the right thing now? Keep walking until he collapses? Go back and beg Francis to let him stay? Turn himself into authorities who might not believe his story? Ranger whined and pressed his nose against Jeffrey's hand, pulling him back from the spiral. The dog's eyes reflected what little light existed, steady and unwavering. I'm here, that gaze said. We keep going. Jeffrey wiped his face with his sleeve, surprised to find tears he hadn't felt fall. Okay, he whispered to the only family he had left. Okay, we keep going. He didn't know where. He just knew they couldn't stop. Not yet. The cabin appeared like something out of a dream, or maybe a hallucination born from exhaustion and cold. One moment Jeffrey was stumbling through endless darkness, trees pressing in from all sides, and the next he saw a warm glow filtering through windows, golden light spilling onto moss-covered porch steps. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, carrying the smell of burning wood and something else, something that made his empty stomach clench with desperate hunger. Jeffrey froze at the edge of the clearing, one hand gripping Ranger's collar to keep the dog from rushing forward. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The cabin looked old but well-maintained, tucked between towering pines like it had grown there naturally. Flower boxes hung beneath the windows despite the season. A wooden rocking chair sat on the porch beside a neatly stacked cord of firewood. Someone lived here. Someone was home right now, probably sitting down to dinner, while Jeffrey stood shivering in their woods like some feral creature. This is trespassing, his father's voice reminded him. You can't just show up at someone's house uninvited. But what choice did he have? The temperature had dropped below freezing. His fingers were so numb he could barely feel them anymore. Ranger was shaking despite his thick coat, and Jeffrey's legs felt like they might give out any second. He could walk away, keep searching for somewhere else, but there was nowhere else. Just more trees, more darkness, more cold that would steal his body heat 1 degree at a time, until he simply stopped moving. Jeffrey stepped into the clearing. Each footfall felt like a small betrayal of everything his father taught him about respecting people's property and privacy. But his father wasn't here to offer better options. His father was ash in an urn on Francis's mantle, and Jeffrey was alone with choices that all felt wrong. He climbed the porch steps, his boots heavy and clumsy. Ranger stayed pressed to his side, unusually quiet, as if the dog understood the delicacy of this moment. Jeffrey raised his fist to knock, then hesitated. What would he even say? Hi, I'm homeless. Can you help me? Will they call the police? Send him back to Francis? Shut the door in his face the way the whole neighborhood had? He knocked anyway. 3 soft raps that sounded too loud in the quiet woods. Footsteps approached from inside. The door opened, releasing a wave of warmth and the rich smell of stew. An elderly man stood in the doorway, probably in his 70s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and silver hair combed neatly to the side. Behind him, a woman appeared, his wife. Jeffrey assumed with soft features and concerned eyes that went immediately to Jeffrey's face, then down to Ranger, then back up again with obvious worry. Oh my goodness, the woman said, her voice gentle and horrified all at once. Edward, look at this child. He's frozen. The man, Edward, studied Jeffrey for a long moment. No judgment crossed his weathered face, just a deepening concern. What are you doing out here, son? Are you lost? Jeffrey's throat closed. He tried to speak, but no words came. He was so tired, so cold, so completely done with pretending he had any control over his life. Come in, Margaret said, already reaching for his arm. Come in, child. You look frozen. Let's get you fed. The first night blurred into warmth and kindness Jeffrey hadn't experienced in months. Margaret sat in by the fireplace with thick blankets while Edward fed Ranger scraps of beef from the stew pot. They didn't push for explanations, didn't bombard him with questions he wasn't ready to answer. They just offered food, warmth, and a couch to sleep on with clean sheets that smelled like lavender. When Jeffrey finally told them pieces of his story the next morning, his father's death, Francis's cruelty, the desperate walk into the woods, Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Edward's jaw tightened with quiet anger at adults who could fail a child so completely. They didn't call anyone. They didn't turn him away. They just said he could stay as long as he needed. Days slipped into a routine that felt almost normal. Jeffrey woke to the smell of coffee and pancakes. He helped Edward chop firewood and stack on the porch, his muscles burning in a way that felt good, productive, like he was earning his place instead of being a burden. Margaret taught him to cook proper meals, not the frozen dinners and fast food his father had relied on during the hard years, but real food made from scratch with ingredients from their pantry and garden. They asked about his life before. Jeffrey told them about his father's pharmacy job, the camping trips they used to take, the way his dad would read to him every night, even when Jeffrey got too old for it. He told them about his mother leaving when he was 6, about Francis's cold tolerance that became outright hostility after the funeral. Edward listened with the attention Jeffrey's own father used to give him, nodding in the right places, asking gentle questions that showed he actually cared about the answers. Margaret reminded Jeffrey of the grandmother he'd never had before. Both his father's parents had died before he was born. She fussed over whether he was eating enough, made sure his clothes were washed, checked that Ranger had fresh water in his bowl. Small kindnesses that added up to something bigger, something Jeffrey hadn't realized he was starving for. In the evenings, they sat together in the living room. Edward read his newspaper while Margaret knitted. Jeffrey did homework from textbooks they'd somehow acquired. Edward had connections in town. He explained vaguely, people who could get things without asking too many questions. Ranger sprawled on the rug between them, content in a way the dog hadn't been since before Jeffrey's father got sick. By the 4th night, Jeffrey felt something dangerous blooming in his chest. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope he'd carried into the woods, but something steadier. Something that whispered, maybe this is it. Maybe you found where you belong. We never had children, Margaret said one evening, her knitting needles clicking softly. Always wanted them, but it just didn't happen for us. Edward glanced at Jeffrey over his newspaper, his expression unreadable. The house has been too quiet for too long. Jeffrey's throat tightened. They weren't saying it directly, but he heard the implication. Stay. Be ours. Let's be yours. For the first time since his father died, Jeffrey thought maybe everything would be okay after all. The change in Ranger started subtly. The dog would stop mid-step in the hallway, ears rotating forward like satellite dishes picking up signals Jeffrey couldn't hear. He'd growl at nothing or what appeared to be nothing, his hackles rising as he stared at the basement door with an intensity that made Jeffrey's skin prickle. He's just settling in, Margaret assured him when Jeffrey mentioned it. New place, new smells. Dogs need time to adjust. But Ranger had adjusted to everything else. He loved the cabin, loved the woods where Edward let him run free during the day, and loved the scraps Margaret saved from dinner. It was only the basement that triggered this reaction, this primal warning system that Jeffrey had learned to trust during years of relying on the dog's instincts. The basement door stayed locked. Jeffrey had tried it once out of curiosity and found it secured with a deadbolt that looked newer than the rest of the cabin's hardware. When he asked Edward about it, the old man's smile never wavered. Just storage down there. Old furniture, boxes of junk we keep meaning to sort through. Nothing interesting, trust me. But if it was just junk, why the heavy-duty lock? Why did Edward keep the only key on a chain around his neck, tucked beneath his shirt like something precious? Other oddities began stacking up, small inconsistencies that individually meant nothing, but together formed a pattern Jeffrey couldn't ignore. Edward said he'd been a teacher before retirement, but when Jeffrey asked what subject, the answer changed first to history, then English, then science, as if Edward couldn't remember his own career. Margaret mentioned living in the cabin for 30 years, but later said they'd only been there 15. When Jeffrey pointed out the contradiction, She laughed it off as an old woman's failing memory, but her eyes had gone sharp for just a moment, calculating. The visitors came at night. Jeffrey would wake to the sound of car engines cutting off at the end of the long driveway, followed by hushed voices on the porch. Edward would slip outside, closing the door carefully behind him, leaving Margaret inside to monitor Jeffrey's room like a guard. Conversations happened in whispers too low to make out words, but the tone was always urgent, transactional. Business, not social calls. Then engines would start again and fade into the distance, and Edward would return smelling like cigarette smoke and diesel fuel. Just a friend dropping off supplies. Edward explained once when Jeffrey caught him coming back inside at 2 in the morning. Didn't want to wake you. But what kind of supplies arrived in the dead of night? What kind of friend never came to the door, never stayed for coffee, never showed their face? Jeffrey started noticing the phone calls too. Edward would step outside with his cell, pacing the porch while speaking in that same hushed, urgent tone. Margaret would watch through the window, her knitting forgotten in her lap, her expression tight with worry that vanished the moment she noticed Jeffrey looking. They were hiding something. Something big enough to require locks and lies and visitors who only came after dark. Jeffrey told himself he was being paranoid. They'd saved him, give him shelter when he has nothing. They were good people. But Ranger's growls at the basement door grew more insistent each day, and Jeffrey's instincts honed by years of reading Frances's moods to avoid her anger screamed that something was very, very wrong. It happened on the 8th night. Jeffrey woke to Ranger's low, insistent growl, not the warning sound he'd been making all week, but something deeper, more urgent. Before Jeffrey could reach for his collar, the dog bolted from the room, nails scrabbling against hardwood as he raced down the hallway toward the basement door. Ranger no. Jeffrey scrambled after him, heart pounding. If the dog woke Edward and Margaret, if he damaged something, they might change their minds about letting him stay. Ranger, come back. But the dog was fixated, pawing frantically at the basement door, whining and barking in a way Jeffrey had never heard before. Not aggressive, desperate, like something down there was calling to him, demanding his attention. Jeffrey reached for the dog's collar and froze. The door was open, not just unlocked, actually open, swinging slightly on its hinges like someone had left in a hurry and forgotten to secure it. Warm air drifted up from below, carrying a smell that didn't belong in a storage basement. Machine oil, old paper, and something chemical that burned Jeffrey's nostrils. Ranger pushed through before Jeffrey could stop him, disappearing down wooden steps into darkness. Jeffrey stood at the threshold, every instinct screaming at him to go back to bed, to pretend he'd never seen this. But if something happened to Ranger down there, if the dog got hurt in Edward's junk storage, Jeffrey would never forgive himself. He found a flashlight hanging by the door and descended. The basement was nothing like Edward described. No dusty furniture or forgotten boxes. The space was organized like a warehouse, lit by battery-powered lanterns that cast harsh shadows across rows of wooden crates and plastic containers stacked with military precision. Shipping labels covered every surface, stamped with foreign customs marks and destination cities Jeffrey recognized from news reports: Istanbul, Dubai, Moscow, Singapore. Ranger stood rigid near the far wall, his attention locked on a crate with its lid slightly ajar. Jeffrey approached on numb legs, his flashlight beam shaking. Inside the crate, wrapped in protective cloth, were objects that made his breath catch. Ancient pottery marked with museum catalog numbers, carved statues still tagged with inventory labels, rolled canvases that might have been paintings. Beautiful things that didn't belong in someone's basement. A folder lay open on a work table nearby. Jeffrey picked it up with trembling hands, scanning documents that his 14-year-old brain struggled to process, but understood enough to feel sick. Shipping manifests, customs forms with forged stamps, bills of sale with signatures that looked practiced but didn't match across different pages. Lists of buyers and prices that made Jeffrey's eyes water. $50,000 for a statue, $200,000 for a painting, amounts of money that couldn't be real. Stolen, Jeffrey whispered, the word hollow in the warehouse-like space. His flashlight beam caught more crates, more containers, More evidence of an operation that had clearly been running for years, maybe decades. This wasn't some small-time theft. This was organized, professional, connected to networks that span continents. And Edward and Margaret weren't retired teachers living quietly in the woods. They were criminals, smugglers, fences for stolen antiquities, and artwork worth millions. The warmth drained from Jeffrey's body, replaced by ice-cold understanding. The locked door, the nighttime visitors, the inconsistent stories, the way they'd welcomed him so easily, no questions asked, no authorities contacted. This whole time his mind screamed. This whole time you've been living with people who... Footsteps creaked on the stairs above. The flashlight beam swept across the basement before Jeffrey could move, pinning him like a specimen under glass. He spun around, heart hammering, to find Edward and Margaret standing at the bottom of the stairs. Neither looked angry. That somehow made it worse. "So," Edward said quietly, his voice carrying none of the warmth Jeffrey had grown used to. "You found it." Jeffrey's mouth went dry. His mind raced through excuses, explanations, but what was the point? The evidence surrounded his crates, stamped with custom seals from countries he'd barely heard of, paintings wrapped in protective cloth, documents with official-looking stamps scattered across a workbench. He'd seen enough crime shows to know what this was. "I didn't mean Ranger got out, and The words died in his throat. Margaret descended the remaining steps, her expression gentle, almost sad. "It's all right, sweetheart. Come sit down. Let's talk about this like adults." She gestured to an old couch tucked against the far wall, position where someone could sit and survey the entire operation. Jeffrey's legs felt unsteady as he moved toward it, Ranger pressing protectively against his side. Edward followed, pulling up a wooden chair and sitting with his hands folded, like they were about to discuss Jeffrey's grades instead of a basement full of stolen goods. "We're not bad people," Margaret began, settling beside Jeffrey with the same maternal warmth she'd shown every night tucking him in. "What you're seeing here, it's complicated. These items were stolen once, during wars, by governments and armies. We're just moving them to people who'll actually appreciate them. Private collectors, museums willing to pay. Nobody gets hurt. That's still illegal," Jeffrey said, his voice barely above a whisper. "So are a lot of things," Edward replied calmly. "Stealing bread when you're starving. Trespassing on someone's property when you're homeless." He let that hang in the air, not cruel, just factual. Laws don't always account for circumstances, do they? Jeffrey's hands trembled. He wanted to argue, to say it wasn't the same thing, but wasn't it? He'd broken laws out of desperation. Were Edward and Margaret so different? "We've been doing this for 30 years, Edward continued. "Never hurt anyone. Never stolen from regular people. These artifacts, they'd rot in government warehouses or private vaults where nobody sees them. At least this way, they're valued. Cherished." Margaret reached over and took Jeffrey's hand, her touch warm and familiar. "You have to understand something, sweetheart. When we found you on our porch that night, frozen and desperate, we saw ourselves. We know what it's like when the world gives up on you, when you have to make choices nobody should have to make. We love you," she said, and Jeffrey's chest was constricted because he could hear the truth in it. These people who'd fed him, sheltered him, treated him like family did love him. In their own broken way, they genuinely cared. "You belong here with us. But I need to know you can keep this quiet," Edward added, his tone still gentle but with an edge of steel underneath. "What happens in this basement stays in this basement. Can you do that for us? For your family?" There it was. The choice laid bare. Stay silent and keep this life, the warmth, the belonging, the only people who'd wanted him since his father died. Or to tell the truth and lose everything again. "Your stepmother threw you away like garbage," Margaret said softly, squeezing his hand. "We're giving you a family, a real home. All we're asking is your silence." "That's not so much, is it?" Jeffrey looked at their faces, kind, hopeful, genuinely caring despite the criminality surrounding them. Then he looked at Ranger, whose eyes held a different message, something wild and honest that couldn't be rationalized away. "I need to think," Jeffrey whispered. Edward nodded slowly. "Of course. Take your time." "But Jeffrey," he leaned forward, his voice dropping. Think carefully about what you'd be going back to. Because if you can't keep our secret, you can't stay here. And where else do you have to go? That night, Jeffrey lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind churning through impossible calculations. Edward and Margaret had gone to their room, trusting him, or perhaps monitoring him, he couldn't tell anymore. Ranger lay pressed against his side, warm and steady, the dog's breathing the only sound in the suffocating quiet. His father's voice echoed in his memory. Always do right, even when it costs you. But what did right mean when every choice led to loss? Expose Edward and Margaret, and he'd be back on the streets, or worse, in foster care. Or return to Francis, who'd make his life hell for the attention he'd brought. Stay silent, and he'd have a home, people who loved him, security he'd never known. Was that so wrong? They weren't hurting anyone. They'd said so themselves. Except they were criminals. And silence made him complicit, made him one of them. Jeffrey turned over, pulling his father's jacket close, breathing in the fading scent of Old Spice and cigarettes. What would his dad do? But he knew the answer. His father had always chosen integrity over ease, even when it meant working double shifts, even when it meant poverty, even when it meant dying with debts he couldn't pay, even when it cost you. Dawn broke over the cabin, and Jeffrey still hadn't slept. But by the time light filled his window, he knew what he had to do. He just didn't know if he had the courage to do it. The police cars appeared 3 days later, their red and blue lights strobing through the cabin windows at dawn. Jeffrey jolted awake on the couch, his heart instantly racing. Ranger was already at the window, growling low and steady. Through the glass, Jeffrey counted 4 vehicles blocking the long driveway. 2 sheriff's cruisers, an unmarked sedan, and behind them, a silver SUV he recognized with sickening clarity. Francis's car. Edward moved with surprising speed for his age, appearing in the living room fully dressed like he'd been expecting this. Margaret emerged from the kitchen, her face pale but composed. They exchanged a look that communicated volumes, a look that said they'd planned for this scenario, rehearsed it, and knew exactly what to do. "Jeffrey," Edward said quietly, his hand gripping the boy's shoulder with gentle but unmistakable pressure. "Listen very carefully. You tell them we're family friends, that you came here willingly, that we've been taking care of you properly. Nothing more." A knock thundered on the door. "Sheriff's Department. We need to speak with the residents." Margaret smoothed her cardigan and opened the door with a concerned, grandmotherly smile that would have fooled anyone who hadn't seen what Jeffrey had seen in that basement. "Officers, goodness, what's this about?" The lead deputy, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped inside without waiting for invitation. "We're investigating smuggling activity in the region. Your property came up in our inquiries." Her gaze swept the cabin, landing on Jeffrey. "And we received a report about a minor staying here without proper guardianship." Frances pushed past the deputy, her face a perfect mask of maternal worry that made Jeffrey's stomach turn. "Jeffrey, oh thank God." She rushed toward him, reaching like she might embrace him, but stopped when Ranger's growl intensified. "I've been looking everywhere for you. I was so worried." The lies came so easily to her. Jeffrey watched in stunned silence as Frances performed concern for the authorities, dabbing at dry eyes with a tissue, explaining how Jeffrey had run away after she tried to enforce reasonable boundaries. How she'd been frantic. How she called everyone, searched everywhere, filed a missing person report. Except Jeffrey knew she'd done none of those things. She'd thrown him out and moved on with her life, probably already spending his father's death benefits on herself. "Is this true?" the deputy asked Jeffrey. "You ran away?" Edward's hand tightened on his shoulder. A reminder. A warning. Margaret watched from across the room, her expression pleading, "Don't betray us. Don't destroy this family." "We could take you home," Frances said, her voice syrupy sweet for the audience. "I know we had our disagreement, but I've been sick with worry. You belong with your family, Jeffrey. Your real family." The deputy's radio crackled with static. Another officer appeared at the door. "Ma'am, we've got a warrant for the basement. Anonymous tip about the smuggling operation." Jeffrey felt Edward's hand go rigid, saw the flash of panic cross Margaret's carefully composed face. They knew it was over the operation, the cabin, the life they'd built on decades of crimes. The only question was whether Jeffrey would go down with them. "Son," Edward said, his voice dropping to a whisper only Jeffrey could hear. "If you say anything, you lose everything. Again, foster care at best. Back with her at worst. But if you stay quiet, if you tell them you don't know anything about the basement, there's a chance we all walk away from this. A chance to keep your family." Francis reached for Jeffrey's arm. "Come on, sweetie. Let's go home." The deputy watched Jeffrey's face, reading the conflict there with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen too many scared kids caught between impossible choices. "Jeffrey," she said gently, "if there's something you need to tell us, now's the time. The truth is nothing but the truth." Ranger pressed against Jeffrey's leg. The only honest, uncomplicated love in his entire life. The only one who'd never lied, never manipulated, never offered belonging with strings attached. Jeffrey looked at Edward and Margaret, the people who'd given him warmth and shelter and something that felt like love, even if it was built on a foundation of lies. Then at Frances, the woman who'd thrown him away like garbage, now performing motherhood for the cops. Two forms of captivity, two different prisons. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Always do right, even when it costs you everything." Jeffrey took a breath that felt like it might split him in half. "I need to tell you about the basement," he said. The words came out shaky at first, then gained momentum like a dam breaking. Jeffrey told them everything. The locked basement, the late-night visitors, the crates of stolen artifacts, the shipping manifests with false customs declarations. He described what he'd seen in detail: paintings wrapped in protective cloth, documents with official seals, Edward's careful cataloging system that tracked each item's origin and destination. Margaret's face crumpled, not with anger, but with something worse: betrayal, hurt, the look of someone who genuinely loved and been rejected. "Jeffrey," she whispered, her voice breaking. "How could you?" Edward said nothing. He just stood there as officers moved past him toward the basement stairs, his expression shifting from shock to resignation to something that might have been respect. He looked at Jeffrey with eyes that seemed suddenly ancient, tired. "You're more like your father than I thought," he said quietly. "That's not a compliment to us, but it should be to you." The arrest happened quickly. Miranda Wrights read in monotone. Handcuffs clicked around wrists that had chopped firewood and served dinner and patted Jeffrey's shoulder goodnight. Margaret cried as they let her out, still looking back at Jeffrey like he was the child who'd disappointed her, not the criminal who'd exploited his desperation. Frances tried to leave during the chaos, edging toward her SUV while deputies were distracted. But the lead deputy had been watching, reading the situation with experienced eyes. "Ma'am, we're going to need to talk about the circumstances that led a 14-year-old to end up homeless in the woods. Child Protective Services will want a statement." The color drained from Frances's face. Her performance of maternal concern evaporated instantly, replaced by cold calculation as she realized she'd walked into scrutiny she couldn't escape. "I want a lawyer." "That's your right," the deputy said. "But abandoning a minor is a serious charge." Jeffrey watched Frances being questioned by another officer, watched her lies unravel under professional interrogation. There was no satisfaction in it, just a hollow acknowledgement that this woman had never wanted him, and now everyone would know it. The social worker who arrived 2 hours later had kind eyes and honest answers. Foster care wouldn't be perfect, she explained gently. Jeffrey would be placed with a family, but it might take time to find the right fit. There would be therapy, legal proceedings, uncertainty about his future. No fairy tale ending. No sudden windfall or perfect family waiting in the wings. "But we'll be honest," she said. "No more lies. No more conditions on love. That's worth something, isn't it?" Jeffrey looked down at Ranger, who'd refused to leave his side through everything. The dog gazed back with steady, loyal eyes that had never wavered, never judged, never asked Jeffrey to be anything other than who he was. "Can he come with me?" Jeffrey asked, his voice small. "We'll make sure of it," she promised. 6 months later, Jeffrey stood in his foster family's bathroom, getting ready for school. The Hendersons weren't perfect. Mr. Henderson worked too much. Mrs. Henderson worried too much. Their teenage daughter mostly ignored him. But they were real. They didn't lie about who they were. They didn't offer love with invisible strings attached. Jeffrey met his own eyes in the mirror. He looked older than 14, aged by everything he'd survived. But he could hold his own gaze without flinching, without shame. He'd chosen the harder path, homelessness over Francis's cruelty, truth over Edward and Margaret's seductive lies, uncertainty over comfortable captivity. His father had been right. The right choice wasn't always the easy one, but it was the only choice that let you look in the mirror and recognize the person looking back. Ranger barked from downstairs, impatient for their morning walk. Jeffrey smiled a real smile, earned through pain, but genuine. He grabbed his backpack and headed down to meet the only family member who'd been with him through it all, loyal and true from the very beginning. The future was uncertain, but it was his, and that made all the difference. So here's a question for you. If someone offered you everything you ever wanted, a home, a family, belonging, but you had to compromise who you are to keep it, what would you choose? Jeffrey chose truth over comfort, integrity over security, the hard right over the easy wrong. He lost the illusion of family, but kept his soul. In the end, that was the only treasure that mattered, the one thing no one could take from him, because he'd refused to give it away.